the good stuff.
Is it appropriate that I'm Loki?
And God? Yeah, because Loki would be very happy with that, whereas Bucky Barnes and the Devil, you're kind of reading into the whole, you know, what they want you to think versus what actually is.
I'm done. I don't have any... I haven't seen... So I don't have an argument.
I will get you some comic books and get you into the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and it'll be beautiful and lovely, and you can speak the same language I do.
I love how I'm like, hey, Katie's daughter, let's get you into horror films, and your response is comic books. Here you go.
Pretty much. Hey, you're listening to Art, I Swear. I'm Katie Gibbs.
I'm Vanessa Van Alstyne.
And we're continuing on our LGBTQ podcast series of the month. Today we're going to cover Agnest Martin.
And this is podcast 204. And just a reminder, on June 12th, 2016, there were over 100 people shot in an Orlando, Florida nightclub. More than 50 of those people died. Their only crime was being at a gay club. I'm gonna bet not even all of them were gay. And to help with tolerance, that's why we're doing this podcast.
Or this podcast series, anyway.
Yeah, that's...
And we're gonna give another shout out at the end of the podcast, but we'd like to reach out to you, our listeners, for suggestions on any more LGBTQ artists that you like, anything that you can suggest. Please email us. Please hit us up on Facebook. Any method of communication, save smoke signals, because I always misinterpret those. Let us know what you think, and let us know if there's somebody you want us to cover, and we will do our darndest.
The email is artiswear@gmail.com. We have a Discus comment system on our webpage, and yeah. So the quote we're going to start this out with is from Agnest Martin. "A world without objects, without interruption or obstacle. It is to accept the necessity of going into a field of vision as you would cross an empty beach to look at the ocean."
So a lot of the information from today's podcast comes from Nancy Princenthal's discussion with the Tate Modern on YouTube. I'm going to say a quick bless you to Vanessa for listening to that entire biography, because that's time of your life that you can never get back. We love you, Agnes Martin, but your biographer was...
Oh my god, boring. Nancy, I'm sure you're fun at parties, but, dude, maybe you're not an orator.
It wasn't your forte, and that's okay.
Some people are nervous academics, and we need them, but yeah.
Hey, remind me to tell you the stories of when I had to present in academia. Yeah.
I gave orals.
We're not talking about how you got your grades.
Anyways. The lecture was called Innocence the Hard Way. A lot of people talk about Agnes Martin's work as being innocent. I feel like that's because it's pastel. She's a female, and she wasn't married. All of which annoy me, because none of that is innocent. It's just that, and we'll get into this, our society has some weird ideas about women that don't get married.
Oh, are we talking about the Boston marriages?
That's a great stuff your mom never told you. And words like spinster and how they apply to women who are lesbians, like Agnes Martin. And she really didn't come out of the closet until way late in her life. And some of that makes sense. She was born in 1914 in rural Saskatchewan. So...
It says 1912 on here.
Oh, 1912. Yeah.
She was born in 1912 in rural Saskatchewan. And that's actually the same year as Jackson Pollock.
Yeah. And one of the points about lesbians that were... she was kind of born during the Victorian era, pre-World War I. You got words like spinster and Boston marriage and roommate that are these code words for women that live together, because if you were a lesbian, even if people knew that you preferred women romantically, it was like, well, they can smooch, but there's no penis, so there's no sex. Like, what could they possibly do that is the sex? Oh yeah, forewarning, you might not, your kids, I mean, this is about, anyways.
This is about as deep as it gets for our bad words or things you might want to warn your children about, but that's, the warning goes on every podcast that we do. Just be aware that we do use some adult language. We don't sugarcoat, the parts of the body.
That's why I say this podcast is PG-13 as a default, especially because we have to, there's a lot of nudes in art. If it's going to be graphic, like if we cover an erotic artist or someone who did a lot of like very disturbing or sexual themes, we will warn you.
Oh yeah. Blatant warnings, way ahead of time. And we will do our darndest not to giggle, because that would be rude. Anywho, back to Agnes.
But yeah, society just kind of had a don't ask, don't tell policy about lesbians. If I can even give a personal example here, I remember in the late 80s, my mother talking to her mom, my grandmother, about the gay rights movement and how, like, gay people are drawing all of this attention. My grandmother, who was probably already, like, 2 sheets out of 3 to the wind, like, puffs up like this angry bird with her little white helmet hair, Texas helmet hair. And she goes, I don't understand why everybody has to make such a big deal about all these gays. Don't you know your cousin, name omitted, and her roommate, name omitted, are both lesbians, but we just treat them like they're family. We invite them to Christmas. They've always lived together. You know exactly what's going on, but nobody needs to talk about it, and I don't understand why people need to talk about it now. And that was the sentiment.
They were both named name omitted. That's got to be really confusing your Christmas cards.
They lived their whole lives as closeted lesbians. Closeted. I'm putting some quotes on this because apparently everyone in the family knew. I have another relative who was a gay man that everybody just called him a bachelor and said that he was effeminate, and that was the first adult I ever met where I was all like, oh, this is a homosexual. But nobody would confirm that because that would be rude.
That would be confirming the truth.
Yeah.
And we don't confirm the truth here in Texas. We deny. Thank you, abstinence sexual education.
Well, and he was a lawyer, so it was kind of to his benefit to stay in the... But this is, he died in his 80s in, like, the 1990s.
Oh, my.
Yeah, so he was not... It was a different time. I'm not saying it's okay now. I'm just saying that this is the curtain that's put across them. Bi people are basically erased because if they have straight relationships, they're straight. If they have gay relationships, they're gay. And it's still kind of that way to a point. Like, I feel like we don't acknowledge bisexuality as much as we do, like, gay or lesbians. Like, Freddie Mercury, really bisexual.
Or the nature of sexuality as a fluid substance. It can change just as people can change as they age.
But because of religion, we like to pretend that women like Agnest Martin were just these, like, stoic religious women that were more interested in academia than children and
asexual completely.
Yeah, which is, it's not the case. She had lovers. It's just, that's part of, though, how we have to explain this. Being a gay person was never a focus of her art. To my knowledge, she did not make a lot of real bold statements about being a homosexual because she was raised in a climate where you just don't talk about that.
Right. So a lot of her identity, at least her sexuality, had to be contained. And
her biographer painted her childhood as very Little House on the Prairie. She was from Macklin, Saskatchewan in Kansas. Or not Canada. She was from Macklin, Saskatchewan in Canada. Not a lot of people born around then. There was no water. There's no, piping, no plumbing. There's no electricity.
I'm sorry. Dihydrogen oxide had not been invented yet.
Dihydrogen monoxide's gonna get you.
Dihydrogen oxide. Dihydrogen monoxide might.
Yep.
Okay.
Something's gonna get you because you're a bad person. And the biographer made a lot of points about how the landscape in that part of Saskatchewan, it looks like the low part of the Texas Hill Country. There's like these little like plateaus that are just very flat hills, but it's still pretty flat. It's not like Great Plains flat. And she wanted to compare her art to that and then the scenery in New Mexico. But Agnest Martin very like vehemently denies this. One thing is that she lived most of her life in Taos, which is a mountain town. And
Taos, New Mexico.
I do not understand how you were comparing Taos, New Mexico to Plains.
No, one of these things is not like the other.
There are parts of New Mexico, and I was born in far west Texas. My father is from Hobbs, New Mexico, or one of my fathers. We'll get into that on another podcast. I have more than one. So I spent a lot of time between Midland and like Albuquerque, and yeah, when you get into like Alamogordo and Hobbs and Las Cruces, that's flat. There's nothing there. There's like some scrub brush and sand. But when you get to the high mountains, that's the Rocky Mountains. Those are huge. It's like, if you saw Django Unchained, they had the birch forest outside of El Paso, and it's like, what?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you're like, what? There's a tree anywhere near El Paso, let alone a birch tree.
Oh, goodness. They
have mountains in El Paso, and the Rio Grande grows through it, but you can like honestly drive a Jeep through it. But there's no forest. Not anywhere near El Paso.
There's no civilization. Sorry, El Paso, but seriously.
Ugh. Yeah.
So anyway, Agnest Martin denied that the landscape had anything to do or influence with her artistic career.
And part of that is one of the appropriate avenues for female painters, especially from the time period when she was born, was landscape. That was a polite thing for ladies of wealth to indulge in while they were waiting for their food that they were making for dinner to finish in the oven, or
waiting for their husband to get home while their maid was cooking dinner.
Yeah, that's more accurate. She was enough of a feminist that she wanted to step away from like, oh, well, I'm a nice lady that paints landscapes and am very proper.
She also loved water and apparently tried out for the Olympics as a swimmer.
She didn't get in, and it was 32, the same year she came to America, which...
Oh, right, Canada.
Yeah, because she's from Canada. She got a BS and an MA from Teachers College, Columbia University, New York. She taught in public schools in Washington, Delaware, and New Mexico during the late 30s and the 40s, at the University of New Mexico in the late 40s, and at Eastern Oregon College, La Grande from 52 to 53. She became a United States citizen in 1950, and that's sourced from the Guggenheim Museum's page.
So why did she take her degrees in art history and not art?
Sad to say, that's a more appropriate degree for a woman.
God dang it!
Well, also, she has to look at the fact that she has to make a living, and there's what are considered appropriate fields for women, and one of those is education. A lot of women at the time, if you were going to be a spinster, if you were going to be unmarried, it was considered that was appropriate for teaching, because then you wouldn't be in conflict with your husband's and his needs. Like, some women would teach until they got married, but if they could get a woman who was dedicated to not getting married, but gosh, wasn't one of those dirty lesbians, that was considered like the ideal set of circumstances, because you don't want your teacher moving away every couple of years because she
fell in love,
wanted to get hitched.
And the only reason I curse the standards on art history degrees is because I have one. I'm looking at it right now, that overpriced piece of paper on the wall, and it's beautiful, and I graduated cum laude, and so far it has done absolutely nothing for me in getting a job. Thanks.
At least you didn't finish your MFA and sell out to become an evil web marketer. Ha 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 ha.
Yeah, but you're still using yours.
Sort of. Yeah, I have to explain to people, like, demand I explain to them how I'm using my degree, and I'm all like, I'm using it in shut your face. That's how I use it. No, I just explain it like a neurotic mess. Anyways.
Alright, so, to carry on, you can tell how interested we are in this podcast.
This was one of the most painful research subjects I have bothered with in the podcast. I usually try to stick to people I'm interested in, but there were so few people that weren't just gay males.
We were reaching. And
she is a huge influence on the history of art. I'm not that big of a fan of her art. She's actually pretty interesting, but
I will agree that she's interesting.
If you look at other art history podcasts, like some of the ones put on by the Tate Modern or NPR, it's very pedantic, and that's part of why I started this podcast, is I wanted some people to have a resource to understand art that isn't just like stuck up snobby and assuming you have a baseline that
right.
You may or may not because of our wonderful public school system.
Well, and I think it says something, too, that we're having so much trouble finding artists outside of the gay male spectrum in our LGBTQ series that it speaks to a lot of the homophobia that even artists have to deal with. And artists are some of the most liberal and open-minded people that I know, with a few exceptions, of course. There's always going to be some. It is this hard to find somebody in the modern genre who defines themselves specifically with, you know, a not hetero lifestyle. It's difficult. So part of the reason that we went for Agnest Martin, even though for a lot of her life she was closeted, is because her artwork didn't define her, but she was still a lesbian woman who created artwork and who actually had a pretty fascinating life, even if her artwork is kind of dull. Sorry, modern artists.
There's a lot of... Here's what we're talking about here. This does kind of emerge in how she lives her life. The Taos art community that she was involved in, it was kind of spearheaded by Georgia O'Keeffe, who a lot of people think was at least bisexual. They'll say lesbian, but she definitely has long-term relationships with men that produce children, and then long-term relationships that are possibly sexual with women. I'm going to call that bisexual, because this isn't an either-or equation. There's a whole bunch of gray in between. It's okay to be bi.
It's not okay to like Georgia O'Keeffe's paintings.
Shut up. We're not here to judge. We're here to educate.
I'm educating people on
Those
not...
flower vaginas are beautifully painted.
That hurt you to say it. I can see the pain in your eyes.
Georgia O'Keeffe's work is very well done. She does have this strong art community that provides a safe haven for gay artists and like kind of just weirdos. I admire her for that. I'm not a huge fan of her artwork. I can't actually say that I like outright hate a lot of artwork. I usually have some appreciation for it. But if you come to my house, there will not be anything that looks like a Georgia O'Keeffe. And some of that is, I grew up like 2 hours from the New Mexico border. I've been beat over the head with Georgia O'Keeffe's and Georgia O'Keeffe ripoffs.
I can appreciate the effort that it took for her to create her work, and I can appreciate the style, but again, it's not going to be in my house because Georgia O'Keeffe is one of those that we get beat over the head with, even just starting out in art history, and it gets hammered into you to the point that you kind of want to put a pencil in your eye socket when you hear the name. Although I do respect the artistic community that surrounded her and what she did. So,
and we're on like weird side tangents. Judy Chicago, speaking of vagina art, is not a lesbian. Stop saying that. She's just not. I wish it was true. I wish she was a big old lesbian. I wish that like she was the queen of the lesbians, but she was just a feminist. She is not a lesbian.
I think this entire podcast today has been side tangents. Just,
It's okay. It's going to be our best podcast ever.
I hope so.
So Agnes Martin, if you're wondering, she doesn't really start painting until the 40s. A lot of that is the influence of being around these gay communities that encourage her to go ahead and venture out. Her first stuff's very academic. And she does end up living in New York City for about 10 years. And if you're wondering, like, how do you keep being a lesbian hidden from people you're around this much? Well, there was kind of the homo part of the abstract expressionists in New York and the hetero part of the abstract expressionists in New York. Like, apparently one of the gay artists that lived on the gay side liked to make fun of what a crazy heterosexual Jackson Pollock was, which should probably come as a surprise to no one who knows anything about him.
He loved the vagina.
Yeah, it's kind of... anyways.
But the point...
This is how you protect yourself if you're a minority group that has to pretend to be invisible. You create groups that provide structure and support and help. And when it's... we are choosing not to see this unless you, like, stick it right in our face. You kind of do that by just, creating your own networks. And Martin doesn't have a lot of long-term relationships over the years. Some of them, they do kind of play off of each other. There's one with a very famous weaver. I'm going to keep names out of this because it gave me some ideas for future podcasts. Most of them I'm going to have to hunt down rare books and such for, but to be continued.
So her influences, Agnes Martin, we are getting back to topic. She was influenced by Zen Buddhism. She liked Piet Mondrian and a lot of the early modernists.
She shared their belief in a spiritual power of pure geometry. If you listen to the Mondrian podcast, a lot of why he was creating this pure abstraction was that he kind of thought that that was a way to, like, cleanse and perfect the world after World War I. And her biographer cannot prove it, but feels that she was exposed to Zen Buddhism, which was the Japanese branch of Buddhism, on the West Coast while she was in college, and it's always affected her life. And it makes sense that that would show up on the West Coast before the rest of the country, because your men coming back from the Pacific during World War II, and then even before that, the trade that we have with Japan is going to show up on the West Coast. Most of the American Japanese immigrants are on the West Coast.
Also, have you met people from California? Also influenced by John Cage. He was a musician around that time who influenced a lot of the modern artists. One of his most known works is called 4 minutes and 33 seconds, and it's actually 4 minutes and 33 seconds of silence.
He also did things like record traffic and other ambient noise because he believed there was a basic rhythm to it.
Right.
Agnes Martin got lumped in with the minimalist artists. She was the same age as the Abexers. Like, we covered that she was born the same year as Jackson Pollock. But she doesn't really start making paintings until the 40s. She very quickly moves into her style. But abstract expressionism, while it wasn't a real solid thing, it tends to have a movement and a vibrancy that's not really present in Martin's work. Like, a lot of her early criticism of her paintings that she's famous for is straight up that it's boring.
I didn't say that out loud, so that's okay.
So we're going to compare Agnes Martin to some artists from other groups that she has been associated with, and hopefully in discussing them you can kind of draw your own conclusions. And I tried to make them chronologically as close as I possibly could, but it's
hard. I do want to say before we really start going into her work that living in both Taos, New Mexico and in Saskatchewan in Canada, she was around a lot of Native American groups. I think we may have mentioned it earlier, but I'm not sure. And you can kind of see the patterning in her work for the same artistic styles as Native American people tend to employ. So it amused me. I wanted to point that out.
So the first piece we're going to talk about by Agnest Martin is Untitled from 1959, and it is a long rectangular canvas with 4 squares outlined in pencil, and it is otherwise completely white. And what I would contrast this to is Jackson Pollock's Lavender Mist. You might remember that from our I Don't Get Modernism #2 or Part 2 podcast. And Lavender Mist was made in 1950. And unlike Martin's like very geometric, solid piece, this is a bunch of squiggly drip drops.
It's a Pollock.
They both have a lot of rhythm. They both move your eye in a very dedicated way, but his is like hot mess. And the other one we're going to look at is Helen Frankenthaler. Also mentioned her vaguely on the What is Modern Art podcast because she was Clement Greenberg's
Main Squeeze.
Oh, we're psychic.
From 1952. And it's another abstract expressionist piece. This one has kind of a pastel theme in the colors, but it's geometric form. It's a little.
It has a very loose, like I'd say, childlike, playful quality. If I'm critiquing it in a kind way,
it's like paint spilled.
It's definitely a watercolor, but it's primary colors, so while they're pastel, they're still very vivid. The one I feel like you have more of a dialogue with is Robert Motherwell's Untitled from 1963. You can see the influence of like Buddhism or like Chinese or Japanese line paintings here, I feel like. It's a long horizontal black dash and like a splashy kind of curve that goes up, and it's just black and white.
But it also has that Pollock feel where the paint seems to be almost organic because you still have drip drops. You still have...
There's the splatter element.
Right.
And I feel like it's more in harmony with Agnest Martin's work only because it has like a simple, like kind of placid beauty, but the line work on all of these abstract expressionist pieces, I would actually like define as slightly violent. Like there's this underlying angst to them that is appropriate for post-World War II New York.
Right.
So that's the abexes. I actually think it's more appropriate if we're going to, especially her early work, critique her, to look at your European modernists. And, you have to remember, especially from our, once again, What is Modern Art podcast and several others, New York City has become, after World War II, the center of the art world, and a lot of your modernist artists from Europe have fled to America to get away from Nazi persecution and war. So
they're fleeing for freedom!
And she has seen these works because of that. And we're going to compare her White Flower from 1960, which is this rectangular canvas. It's a dark gray or black that doesn't appear to be completely solid in color. It has some slight modeling, but it's not real pronounced. And meticulously, there's tons of rows of these rectangular squares with a little smaller square inside of them. It almost looks like weaving.
That's exactly what I was going to say. And that's where the patterning that I feel she pulled a little bit from the Native American, you can see it more here, where it looks like weaving, and it has that similar geometric pattern that you see a lot of influences from Native Americans, Northern Native Americans most especially, but...
Mm-hmm. And I'm having her compared here to Josef Alber's Homage to a Square from 1966, Paul Klee's Ancient Sound Abstract on Black from 1925, and Piet Mondrian's Broadway Boogie Woogie from 1942. What all of these pieces share in common is a very strong adherence to geometry. Alber's is a color study that's actually part of a larger grid. It's these 4 squares of a color palette that are repeating several times on a wall.
It is a very 60s color palette.
I've seen these in person, and they're meticulously done. You can't see the tear lines, and that's from where you would have taped it. And that's the other thing about Martin's work, is it's meticulous. Klee is more loosey-goosey. The squares are not strictly in a grid. The grid's, it's weaving and stuff. You can tell he's not using like a T-square or any kind of ruler. And the reason I brought up the Mondrian, number one, listen to our Mondrian podcast, though it's just me, so it's more boring. 10 times more boring.
Oh, I bring 10 times the fun.
Yeah.
Woo!
You're like one of those bite-sized candy bars.
I think that we need to redefine bite-sized.
My inner fat girl hates you.
That's, I'm the shareable candy size, damn it.
What you and your husband do with your fishbowl is up to you. So, Piet Mondrian... Don't make fish faces at me, you horrible woman.
You're sitting on my bed where we share the fishbowl. You were saying about Mondrian?
You're the reason Jesus cries.
Well...
Okay, Broadway Boogie Woogie was one of his last paintings, and it's this animated piece that looks a lot like Traffic. Quit making fun of the Agnes Martin where people can't hear you, Katie.
Alright, I'll do it out loud, but you're gonna have to edit this piece.
I'm just gonna leave you in sounding like an asshole. Anyways, the Boogie Woogie, it's so you can just see a parallel. Oh my, I'm just gonna...
Ow! That hurt!
However, all of the European modernists are a lot bolder in color, and
That hurt.
that contrast to Martin's love of sweet pastels and understated colors.
You should never get a shoulder tattoo and then raise your hand up in victory on that same arm 2 days after, unless you want to start crying.
I went to give her a friendly, loving pat on the tattoo arm and forgot the tattoo was there only last minute, and so she's crying in pain, and I'm like, I tried to stop myself. I really did not mean to do that, I swear.
It's okay, I do it to myself all the time now. Placement is everything, people. Just remember that. If you get a tattoo, placement is everything. Also tip your tattoo artist.
I used to have a septum piercing, like the space between my nose. I had to take it out because I liked how it felt to pull on it. And I have a little Irish pig nose. That was not attractive. It felt so good. I can't even tell you. Yeah, that's how I charged up my brain. Anyways, just the pull string through my nose. What, don't you have one of those? Worst podcast ever.
Oh my god, we're such space cadets today.
Compared to the Minimalist, I'm going to bring up Agnest Martin's Untitled from 1977, and it's this gradient of like a light baby pink and then a light baby blue, and then it repeats the pink and the blue.
It does have some very defined lines in between the pink and the blue. It's very strong, defined horizontal lines. Insofar as the blue stops and the pink starts. It's very pastel, and it's very boring.
We've compared it here to Donald Judd. Maybe he went by Don, I don't know. Dan Flavin, that's what messed me up. Carl Andre, Yves Klein, and Frank Stella. Yves Klein actually has his own color of blue that he made
beautiful
for his paintings. And it's these weird little bumps are on this one because I like his bumpy paintings better. Like, I want to live in the little alien blue bumpy houses. That's the reason I like it. Don't judge me.
Donald Judd is the one who did the steel boxes.
Yeah, and you can see that hanging on the wall there.
This one is a series of steel geometry is failing me now. Squares that are three-dimensional.
And they're hollow in between with orange coating, so there's a light that passes between them of color, because color reflects off of white walls.
Right, but
very
these are
vividly.
And installed up on the wall this time.
And, I mean, you can see how that works with her, like, pastel gradient between the two. The Carl Andre is honestly a chessboard. And that calls to mind the geometry, but it's on the floor, so that changes how you interact with it. Dan Flavin, and I want to do a podcast on him at some point because I adore him, actually. It's a tube of fluorescent light with a color sheath over it in a corner, and it's supposed to be about how that colored light changes the wall and room.
And it's called Pink Out of a Corner, so the color is pink.
Pink! So you can kind of see where he's in dialogue with Martin, and it's that they have this permission to use these more muted colors, I think is some of the strong parallel here with the minimalist versus the modernists and the abstract expressionists, because they're so attached to like strong, vibrant colors, and it's these, once again, like violent lines or this pure geometry that kind of goes a little beyond what Martin does because her work's so subtle. I feel like the Frank Stella, while it's a minimalist piece, it fits with the one that we use, the White Flower, from the from the European Modernist one, in that it's a op art piece this is so hard to describe. It's a bunch of tiny little lines that move in between each other and give the illusion of two arrows, and the lines also kind of look like they're moving. And she was shown with a lot of the op artists, which op art's really just art that's about visual tricks of the eye.
Trompe l'oeil.
No, that's objects that are small and look real.
It's still tricking the eye.
It's not considered the same thing because a trompe l'oeil is very object-oriented.
All right, that's fair.
It's fair. We'll arm wrestle over it later.
No, you win. I'm going to cede the knowledge to you this time.
Well, there is actually a Frank Stella as of July of 2016 retrospective at the Fort Worth Modern. He's one of the most shown and most retrospected artists from this period. A lot of his work's actually like really brightly colorful. It all relies heavily on the geometrics. This black and white one's a little weird. You can kind of tell that he's trying to fit at this point. But his work also comes after Martin's White Flower, which was created in 1960, and that shows that there probably was an influence in dialogue. She's his predecessor. And, you know, you have to remember she's also a whole lot older than him. So, and that was part of the why I don't want to get clumped in with these kids that are showing in the 60s and 70s. I've already earned my stuff. I'm not an up-and-coming artist like these guys. I get that. So, one of the other things about Agnest Martin is her issues with mental health. And I'm going to start with right now. She was schizophrenic. That has nothing to do with being a lesbian. If you think those two are related, this is not the podcast for you.
Accurate.
She did spend a lot of time between New York and New Mexico. But in the 60s, she was institutionalized several times. And it became obvious that for her mental health, it was better to get away from New York City.
One of the quotes from her is, "I paint with my back to the world." And I think that she was trying to deny
worldly influence.
Correct. So she was striving for that geometry, but worldly influence is going to come into your work anyway. And
I mean, we could speculate a lot about how her role as a gay person influences these paintings. The quiet, understated element of her sexuality maybe reflecting in the quiet, understated way she paints. But that's looking back and kind of seeing what you want to see. Though her biographer emailed her while she was still alive, asking for some information for an interview, and she kind of said to forget everything you know and just decide for yourself.
I will say that it is a very big juxtaposition to see Agnest Martin's work, which is this subtle, pastel, geometric, almost OCD, almost bland work, and then compare that to what must have been a very strong personality and what must have been a very lively person, very smart.
She was supposed to have been very, like, strict and meticulous, too, which makes sense.
That does fit a lot of her work, but...
Yeah, but if you think about the chaos of being schizophrenic, and there's a... And I've had friends that were artists that were schizophrenic that struggle with, even on medication, even on doing talk therapy like she was, and she used, like, meditation and Buddhist principles to help her. There's still always an element of reality is a very fragile thing to me. And I could see that also playing into the artwork a little bit. The, like, subtle way that the paintings bleed in and out, or the graphite lines on her later work are so muted. Maybe that's about how, with a simple erasure, the grid falls apart and everything is chaos. Her biographer did say about this. Do you want to read it?
Although the voices didn't tell her to paint, they seemed to steer clear of her work. The images that came to her through inspirations were fixed and articulate enough to suggest a relationship between visions and voices. She heard and saw things that others didn't.
And because of her failing mental health, there is a long period of time where she doesn't make any artwork. When she's in Taos, she focuses on healing very heavily between 1967 and the early 70s. She made several films at this point. None of them were very well received. But she does pick up representation by Pace Gallery, which is a very famous gallery in New York, and has a retrospective in 1973, and that kind of launches her back into art and makes her enough money to stay comfortable.
And that's part of why she lived a solitary life, we think, because of the schizophrenia. But...
well, I mean, you're going to have, with any mental disease, you're going to have good days and bad days. So being out in a, like, isolated area like that, it's easier to probably cope with the bad days. People aren't going to see it as much.
Right.
And so we're going to talk about a couple of her later pieces, like Untitled Number 14 from 1977. This is a white canvas with pencil grid. The grid's very long. They're more stacked than they are wide.
I'll say that the canvas looks linen in nature and not just white.
I think some of that's age. White
doesn't age well.
It doesn't age well. You have to get very specific whites to keep them from yellowing, and a lot of those are very modern in invention. That's why when they clean up old Renaissance masters, sometimes you're like, whoa, that's vivid. Another one is Fiesta from 1985. This is 4 or 5 solid, like, thick lines
going
horizontally, and in between them are much smaller, more delicate lines. They're perfectly evenly spaced. It's once again on a white canvas. She did some similar to this in, like, Gold Leaf too, but that's the juxtaposition, or I'm sorry, that's the crux of it. It's this simple, orderly thing, and I kind of think it's in a way to control the chaos of her life. I mean, I don't know what else you can say about it. She did pass away in 2004, so she lived into her 90s, which is impressive.
Right.
So why don't you guys tell us, what do you think of Agnest Martin's work? Do we need to shut up and focus on the art more?
I'm sure it's a mix of please talk more and please no more Agnest Martin.
And I do think it's interesting looking at how she stood on her own 2 feet as just this solitary woman with no male partner to, like, ally and buffer her career at all.
Or any partner, for that matter. She never went public with anybody that I'm aware of.
There's some that are well known and that she was with for a couple of years, but yeah, no, there's no... A partner does give you support no matter what gender you're part of. However, as you can tell from some of our podcasts, you can occasionally position yourself so that your partner benefits you. Like Louise Nevelson, if you remember that podcast, Plug Your Kids' Ears, the secret to being a successful artist is fucking. That was her exact...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Remember that. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Don't be judgy, Grandma.
I'm not. I think
Yeah.
she made it work.
Dude, I want to party with Louise Nevelson. Her biographer actually told a story of Agnes Martin didn't really care about how she looked, and Louise Nevelson saw her in a crowd at an art event and tried to dress her up like Louise Nevelson, and Agnes Martin was like, "Oh Lord, no! No!"
Oh my god.
Agnes Martin with crazy, like, eyelashes, tons of charcoal eyeliner, ridiculous hair and furs. Cannot go. No.
That poor woman.
Yeah, it's like I said in the Louise Nevelson podcast, she was kind of her own brand.
Woo.
Yep.
All right, well, I'm going to say that that's a wrap for Agnes Martin. Interesting life. Takes some time to appreciate her work.
If you like very muted and quiet pieces, you would probably enjoy her work. You're not bad for liking it, it's just not my cup of tea.
That's okay. I'm going to, again, reach out to all of our listeners, all 2 of you, to come up to us with any suggestions you have for LGBTQ artists for us to cover. We do have 2 more podcasts for this, and any suggestions would be heartily appreciated.
Do you hate us? Do you love us? You should like, share, and review, and let us know. If you have any other, like, just great ideas, our email is artiswear@gmail.com. And if you're like, man, how do I pump this podcast into my earballs regularly? Well, we are now available on all major podcasting networks.
iTunes, SoundCloud, and more.
Yeah, because I sat down and did that all afternoon.
I'm very proud of you. Thank you for that. Art I Swear is brought to you by Socially Stunning. Do you need website maintenance? Do you need a llama? Do you need social media marketing?
Oh, God, you got like 1.5 right. Your web presence, reputation management, social media marketing, pay-per-click marketing. I have a graphics designer that I'm partnering with. If you need a web page, I've got your back. I can even do SEO, baby. I even do book blurbs and book trailer videos. Or I'll just do an advertising video. Let me know, baby. I want to do it for you.
You can find Vanessa and all her lovely work at socially-stunning.com. That's socially-stunning.com. And also she has a beautiful copy editor. I'm not saying anything, but she's fabulous.
You can find Katie at hottamales.com .org/US.
Stop writing it on bathroom walls. That's all I ask.
Art I Swear would like to thank Joe Giggs. If you are looking for a musician who is absolutely nothing like Agnes Martin, check out Joe Giggs in the New York City area. All samples provided from the Conant Project by Iridile. If you want to learn about number stations like they have on the Americans, check out the Conant Project by Iridile. This has been Art I Swear. Have a creative day. Shut up, Katie. Don't add something stupid.